A man pulls an iron stake out of the ground and throws it on a pile. Under that stake is a grave. He does not know that. Nobody has told him. He is a prisoner on a work detail, and his job today is the lawn. The stakes make the mowing slow, so the stakes come out. By evening, there are thousands of them heaped in the woods. That is where this story begins. Not with a doctor, not with a patient, with a work detail and a lawn. Behind a hospital in central Georgia, the ground was full of these small iron stakes. Each one had a number stamped into it. No name, no date of birth, no date of death. A number. Under every stake lay a human being, and that human being had a name. The name was not lost. It was written down in ink in a book kept indoors. Beside it went a county and an age and the day that person came through the door. Hold on to that because of what this state does with those names later. They were patients of what had been the largest mental hospital in the world. They had died inside its wards. They had been buried on its own land. The state had written their names in its ledgers. On the ground, it gave them numbers instead. Then, in the late 1960s, the men cutting that grass came from a state prison. Nobody recorded where a single stake had stood. One account puts the number at 10,000 markers or more. In a season of easier mowing, the dead lost the last thing they had. Their names had come off the ground long before. Now they lost their addresses too. Today there is a marker at the entrance to Cedar Lane Cemetery. The restoration was not the state's doing. It was started by an advocacy group, and a grassroots campaign paid for the gate. It is worth hearing exactly as it is written. It says the neglected cemeteries nearby hold some 25,000 people. It says a grassroots campaign raised the money to build the gate. It says 2,000 numbered iron markers are on display there. They had been displaced from graves over the years. And it says a life-size bronze angel was placed 175 yards south. The angel is there to serve as a perpetual guardian. There is one more detail, and it is the one that stays with you. The names of the 25,000 believed buried there were written onto a compact disc. The disc was sealed inside the concrete base of the angel. That is what a state does when it still has the names and has lost the graves. It buries the list. Nobody agrees on the number. The marker says 25,000. Other accounts say 30,000. A local museum exhibit puts it closer to 35,000. So after 173 years, we cannot say how many people this place buried. We can only say it was tens of thousands. The first of them arrived on the 15th of December, 1842. His name was Tilman Barnett. He was 30 years old, and he farmed in Bibb County, Georgia. His family brought him to Milledgeville chained to a horse-drawn wagon. The record describes him as violent and destructive. He was the first patient of the Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum. He died the following summer. The cause of death entered in the book was maniacal exhaustion. Of the first 50 patients admitted here, 29 died without ever leaving. 8 were pronounced cured. Those are the numbers from the opening years of the experiment. More than half of the first arrivals never came back out, and the institution kept going and kept growing for another 168 years. The reasons written down for sending people in included intemperance and religious excitement, and ill health and jealousy. This place grew for the next century. At its height, it held between 12 and 13,000 people. It covered around 2,000 acres and about 200 buildings. It had its own farm and its own dairy. It had its own brickyard and its own laundry. It was a city, and the people locked inside it built much of it by hand. For most of Georgia, it did not have a name. It had a word: Milledgeville. Parents used that word to frighten their children. I am going to send you to Milledgeville. Before this story ends, a reporter of 29 will walk into these wards. He will find 48 doctors and not one psychiatrist. A great blues musician will die in a back ward here. The state will pass a law and sterilize more than 3,000 of its own citizens, and 4 of these buildings will be turned into prisons. This is the story of Central State Hospital. It was chartered as an act of mercy. It became the largest asylum on earth. And the question underneath it is not really about medicine. It is this: what happens to the people a state decides it does not have to count? The land came first, and the land was taken. In 1802, the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson took 3 million acres from the Muscogee people. 2 years later, Georgia founded a new capital on that ground. It called the town Milledgeville. It was a frontier settlement built to be a seat of government. The historian Mab Segrest states the sequence plainly. The asylum was opened on land stolen from the Muscogees, and the building was paid for out of state profits from that theft. That is not a metaphor about origins. It is an accounting entry. Georgia turned dispossession into money, and money into a hospital. The idea itself arrived in 1834. Governor Wilson Lumpkin asked the state legislature for funds to build a mental hospital. He was asking Georgia to do something no southern state had done at that scale. 3 years later, in 1837, the legislature passed the bill. It created the State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum. The name tells you what the century believed. Madness, intellectual disability, and epilepsy were 3 doors into one building. Georgia would house all 3 together. The institution's own historians claim it was the first in the world to do that. That claim belongs to the hospital's account of itself. It is worth remembering who is making it. Building it took 5 years. A board of trustees was seated in 1841. The first structure went up 4 stories tall and built in brick. It was finished in October of 1842. And here the record is very specific about whose hands did the work. The asylum was built primarily with enslaved labor. Convicts from the state penitentiary helped raise the perimeter wall. So the first building on this campus was made by 2 groups the state already held: men who were owned and men who were sentenced. The hospital was not built beside the machinery of Georgia bondage. It was built out of it. On the 1st of November, 1842, Governor Charles McDonald signed a proclamation. It announced that the asylum was ready to receive patients. 6 weeks later, Tilman Barnett came up the road chained to a wagon. And the same pattern held on the wards as on the scaffolding. The first people to attend the patients here were enslaved. White attendants did not become the majority until 1849. From the first day, the care and the coercion came from the same source. We know a great deal about those first years because the register survives. A genealogist has transcribed the admission record of the first 888 patients. It runs from 1842 to 1861. Each entry gives a name, a county, an age, and a marital status. Then it gives the symptoms that brought the person in, then the supposed cause of the illness, and then a final column with one of 3 outcomes: discharge, elopement, which is the word the asylum used for escape, or death. Read enough of those entries and the 3rd column starts to dominate. And there is a second thing in this register worth noticing. Go back to that column for the supposed cause. The genealogist who transcribed the book says that for many patients, no cause was listed at all. A person is admitted, described, and closed out, and nobody ever writes down why. Now put that beside the cause of death written for the very first patient: maniacal exhaustion. That is not a diagnosis. It is a description of a man who was agitated until he stopped. So what did the state believe this building was for? It recorded a name, a county, and an age with real care. It stopped caring at exactly the point where a hospital ought to start. In 1845, a physician took charge who is still remembered kindly. His name was Dr. Thomas A. Green. He ran the asylum for more than 30 years. Green believed in what the century called the institution as family. The theory held that a hospital works best when it resembles an extended household. So Green ate with the staff and the patients every day, and he abolished the chains and the ropes. That decision deserves to be stated flatly because it was real. In a building raised by enslaved and convict labor, A doctor removed the restraints. Both of those things are true about the same place at the same time. This is the difficulty at the center of this story. There is no single villain here to point at. Under Green, the numbers moved from about 60 patients to 738. A second building, the women's ward, went up in 1847. The Great Center building was begun in 1855 and completed in 1858. Today that building carries the name Powell, and it is still the face of the campus. But the growth was already outrunning the theory. By 1872, the asylum held 112 patients for every physician. That ratio would not improve for almost 100 years. A doctor with 112 patients is not running a family. He is running a warehouse and calling it a family. Try to make that ratio work on paper. Give the physician a 10-hour day and no other duties at all. Give him 15 minutes with each patient in his care. He finishes his rounds in 3 days and starts again on the 4th. That is the best possible version, and it never existed. He also had admissions to sign and reports to write. He had a building to run. So in practice, a patient saw a doctor rarely and briefly and for something urgent. Everything the founders had promised depended on the opposite of that. The population also changed in kind, not only in size. The asylum had been designed for people in acute crisis who might recover. What filled it instead were the chronically ill and the organically disabled. Many of them were veterans of the Civil War. They had little chance of a successful return to their families, so the institution became custodial. It stopped being a place people passed through. It became a place people were kept. And once an institution is measured by how many people it keeps, everything else follows. So what does a state do when the building it built for emptying starts to fill? The reason the numbers rose is not the reason you would expect. It was not an epidemic of madness in Georgia. Counties began sending the asylum their unwanted and difficult residents. The diagnosis did not much matter. The state had built a place that would accept people, so the state used it. Anyone a county could not manage could be sent up the road. The building's population became a record of what Georgia found inconvenient. Emancipation changed who was sent and changed nothing about the logic. In 1866, the asylum began admitting freed African Americans. Segrest's research shows Milledgeville admitted black patients before the war as well. Segrest describes what followed emancipation as a growing psychiatric fiefdom, brutally segregated by race. Its modern diagnostic categories blame the people that Jim Crow most harmed. The same categories marginalized women, sexual outcasts, and the white poor. The asylum did not stand apart from the society outside its wall. It was a machine for sorting that society, and it ran on the same ideas. The 1880s brought rapid expansion. By 1882, there were 979 patients inside. 40 years after Tilman Barnett arrived, the building held a small town. The promise had been a hospital that would cure people and send them home. What had actually been built was a place people entered and did not leave. And the machinery that would run it for the next 80 years was about to be assembled. To understand what this institution became, stop thinking of it as a hospital. Think of it as a self-sufficient town that nobody could leave. It had farms and a brickyard. It had a larder, a dairy, a kitchen, and a laundry. It had a drying room, a smokehouse, barns, stables, and workshops. And the patients did much of the work. Not only in the fields and the kitchen and the laundry, they also helped build some of the buildings that held them. That labor is recorded in the hospital's own annual reports, without embarrassment. The report for 1908 describes work on the water supply. The grading and terracing, it says, was done entirely by colored patients. And then the report adds a phrase that gives the whole system away. At times when they can best be used in that way. Used. That is the word the institution chose about the people in its care. The farm did have a defensible argument behind it. The work often helped patients who would return to farm life when they were discharged. But the labor entailed little treatment on the part of the staff. And when the wards filled up, the work stopped being therapy, it became the economy of the place. Which raises a question the annual reports never answer. If the patients were doing the work, who was doing the treating? What settled in over these decades has a name in the standard history of this hospital: a pattern of conscious neglect. The staff met the basic daily needs of the people in their charge. Food arrived, beds were made, floors were cleaned, and appropriate treatment for their illnesses was simply not available. Nobody decided to stop treating 12,000 people. There were never enough hands to start. Dr. Theophilus O. Powell took charge in 1879 and stayed until 1907. He was a serious student of psychiatry, and he brought better diagnosis and differentiated wards. He also drew the color line through the campus in brick. Black patients were segregated into their own building, and in 1897, that building burned. The sources record what burned and what it cost. They do not record why. One person died in the fire. Many of the patients caught tuberculosis afterward. Because there was nowhere else to put them, Powell housed the black patients underground. They were kept in tunnels until the building could be rebuilt. Read that sentence again. When the segregated ward burned, the hospital did not open the other wards. It opened the tunnels. In 1898, the asylum changed its name to the Georgia State Sanitarium. The word lunatic came off the letterhead. Nothing under the letterhead moved. By 1909, the state legislature was investigating its own institution. The trigger was an outbreak of tuberculosis. That same year, the sanitarium held 959 black patients. Their quarters were inadequate and overcrowded by at least 300 people. And the annual report of 1910 made a request about the staff who cared for them. Their wages have been the same for many years, it said, and they cannot live on such wages. The institution knew. It wrote the knowledge down, it filed the knowledge, and it changed nothing. There is one name from this period that deserves to be said aloud. In 1910, a young nurse arrived at the sanitarium named Ruth Price. She was born in Savannah in 1886. She trained in North Carolina and then at Providence Hospital in Chicago. The year she arrived, she was 24 years old. She was appointed head nurse of the colored female department. She was the first black woman to hold a position of that rank here. The annual reports mention a trained black nurse overseeing that department. They do not print her name. We know it from elsewhere. She married in 1917 and left. She trained as a mortician and ran a funeral home in Macon with her husband. In 1938, she went back to nursing in the Bibb County Schools and Health Department. Her later name was Ruth Hartley Mosley. Now hold that against the ledgers in the basement. The archive recorded a number for every dead patient in the ground. It did not record the name of the woman running a ward. That is not an accident of paperwork. That is what an archive built by power looks like from inside. The population kept climbing, and the care kept thinning. At the start of 1910, there were 3,206 patients. In 1929, the name changed again to Milledgeville State Hospital. The count passed 5,000. By the late 1930s, the buildings were rated for 5,000 and held more than 7,000. Through the Depression, the count went above 9,000. During the Second World War, the hospital ran with 9 doctors for 8,500 patients. 9. That is not a staffing shortage. That is an arithmetic in which treatment has become impossible. 9 people cannot treat 8,500. So what was actually happening in those wards all day? By the late 1950s, the average population was above 11,800. Only Pilgrim State in New York was larger. In the 1960s, the count reached close to 12,000. Some accounts say 13. Around 200 buildings stood on roughly 2,000 acres. It was, by then, the largest mental hospital in the world. What happened inside those wards was the psychiatry of the age at industrial scale. Insulin shock and electroconvulsive therapy were used in massive numbers. They were used until chemical intervention arrived, and chemistry was cheaper than staff. Lobotomy came to Milledgeville in 1951 for the most chronic cases. 125 severely ill patients were lobotomized. 24 of them were able to go home. An unknown number got worse. Those are the figures that survive. And alongside those techniques were others with no theory behind them at all. Children were confined in metal cages. Adults were put through forced steam baths in cold showers. There were straitjackets. There were douches and nauseants. By the 1950s, the staff-to-patient ratio was 1 to 100. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. It does not mean one member of staff was busy. Picture a night shift in a building full of people. One person is awake, and 100 people are in that person's care. That person could not treat anybody. That person could barely watch anybody. The job was to get the ward to morning without an incident. And the wards at the far end of the campus had their own name, the back wards. They held the people who were never going home. Nobody was coming to review their cases because there were no cases to review. There was a bed, a number, and a very long time. And this is where the two halves of this story meet. Think about the number on the door of a back ward. Then think about the number on the stake in the field. They are the same kind of number. Both exist so that an institution can keep track of a person without knowing one. That is not an accusation of malice. It is a description of scale. Above a certain size, a hospital stops being able to hold people in mind. It can only hold them in a building. The chief clinical psychologist here in 1952 was Dr. Peter G. Cranford. He later wrote a book about the place. He called it, "But for the Grace of God." The subtitle called it The Inside Story of the World's Largest Insane Asylum. And he wrote one sentence about this hospital that is hard to improve on. It has witnessed the heights of man's humanity and the depths of his degradation. Both halves of that sentence are load-bearing. The same building held a doctor who ate with his patients in a room with cages. There is a part of this operation that almost never gets described, and it should be. A hospital of 12,000 people with a death rate is also a funeral business. Caskets were built on the property. There were mortuary services on the grounds. Some bodies went home to their families by train. The receipts for those journeys are still in the files. Many did not go home at all. Some families could not afford it. Some families had already refused the person years before. Those are the people in the numbered graves. The cemetery on that hill is not a mystery. It is what happens when an institution outlives the families of the people inside it. And then there is the part that was not medicine at all, but law. On the 23rd of February, 1937, Governor Rivers signed Georgia's Compulsory Sterilization Act. Georgia was the 32nd state to pass such a law, and the last. Between 1937 and 1963, 3,284 Georgians were sterilized. 45% were men, 55% were women. Through the 1940s, the rate ran at around 80 a year. Milledgeville State Hospital was one of the first two institutions in the state to begin. This was not a doctor exceeding his authority in a back room. It was the policy of the state of Georgia. Its legislature passed it and its governor signed it. Running underneath all of it was a politics that had nothing to do with patients. Memoirs and newspaper accounts from the 1950s and 60s made a specific accusation. They named Georgia politicians, among them the former Speaker Roy V. Harris. They also named the state senator Culver Kidd. The charge was that they pressed hospital administrators to hire their political clients. And those jobs depended on the patient count staying high. If the hospital emptied, the payroll shrank. That accusation belongs to its sources and was never settled in court. Both men are long dead, but the shape of the incentive is a matter of record. An institution paid by the head has a reason not to send anyone home. You can hear what that felt like from inside the superintendent's office. Dr. Y.H. Yarbrough left the job in 1948. "This is one of the happiest days of my life," he said. Then he described the 100-year history of the building he was leaving. He was the only superintendent, he said, who had not been kicked out or carried out feet first in a casket. That is a hospital director describing an institution that destroys its own directors. Not every name in this place is a doctor or a politician. Joseph Ingram began work here in 1898 in the kitchens. He was a black employee at a segregated institution in Georgia at the turn of the century. He stayed for the better part of 6 decades. On the 7th of September, 1953, a building on this campus was named for him. He was the first black man to have a building named for him in Baldwin County. He died in 1956 at the age of 83. A kitchen worker got a building. That is worth setting beside the 25,000 who got numbers. And outside the wall, the place had stopped being a hospital and become a word: Milledgeville. Georgians did not say the name of the institution. They said the name of the town. Parents used it as a threat. "I am going to send you to Milledgeville." The novelist Terry Kay was a boy in Georgia in the 1940s. He remembered it as one of the few words with great power. Milledgeville, city of the crazies, a word of fear and mystery, he said, a word that classified funny people. Thousands of Georgians were shipped there with no clearer label than that, often with conditions that were never specified, often with disabilities that warranted no diagnosis of mental illness at all. Funny was enough. 7 miles from those wards lived Flannery O'Connor. The scholar Mabs Segrest has traced the hospital into her fiction. Her crazy preachers, Segrest says, walk right out of case histories of religious excitement. The asylum was not a distant rumor in Georgia. It was the neighbor everyone could name and nobody would visit. In the summer of 1959, one of the great American musicians was dying in these wards. His name was blind Willie McTell. He was born in Thompson, Georgia in 1898. He was blind from birth or from very early childhood. He played a 12-string guitar because he worked the street and he needed the volume. One of his songs was Statesboro Blues. That is the man. Now here is the ward. A local museum exhibit dates his admission here to the 12th of August, 1959. He died 7 days later on the 19th of August. The cause was a cerebral hemorrhage. He was buried at Jones Grove Church, near the town where he was born. One of the most recorded blues musicians in Georgia died on a state ward. His grave was outside these fences. Tens of thousands of others were not so lucky. And in that same year, a 29-year-old reporter walked into this hospital with a notebook. His name was Jack Nelson, and he worked for the Atlanta Constitution. He had heard the wards described with a phrase that was current at the time: a snake pit. What Nelson found was not a scandal about one bad ward. It was the description of an institution that had stopped functioning as a hospital. Thousands of patients were being served by 48 doctors. Not one of them was a psychiatrist. Not one. At the largest mental institution on earth. Some of those doctors had been hired directly off the mental wards. They had been patients there. They had received psychiatric treatment there. Then they were put on the staff. Patients were helping to run the asylum. 1/4 of the physicians on staff had histories of alcoholism or drug abuse. Doctors and nurses were drunk on the job. A nurse performed major surgery without a doctor supervising, and a physician moonlighting for a pharmaceutical company used experimental drugs on patients. They had not consented. Neither had their families. Take that last one slowly, because it is the worst thing in the file. A doctor with a second income from a drug company had access to 12,000 people. Those people could not leave. Those people could not refuse. Their families had signed them away. Their names, in many cases, had stopped being used outside the building. There is no better definition of a captive population. And do the arithmetic on the rest of it. 48 doctors for something close to 12,000 patients. That is 250 patients per doctor. Give one of them 5 minutes with each patient, once, That comes to nearly 21 hours of talking. No breaks, no notes, no examinations. And at the end of it, he would start again at the top of the list. There was no version of that hospital in which medicine was happening. Everyone who worked there knew it. Everyone who governed Georgia could have known it. The series ran in 1959, and it rocked the state. Staff were fired. The state of Georgia had ignored decades of pleading from its own superintendents. Now it began to send money. In 1960, Jack Nelson won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. The citation reads for the excellent reporting in his series of articles on mental institutions in Georgia. His own newspaper puts it more plainly, for exposing abuses at Milledgeville State Hospital for the insane. He was 29 years old. It is worth being precise about what the Pulitzer changed and what it did not. It did not close the hospital. It did not reduce the patient count. In fact, the population reached its historic peak in the years just after. What it did was end the silence. For more than a century, superintendents had written the truth into annual reports. Nobody outside the building read them. Nelson put it on the front page of a newspaper the governor read. The information had always existed. What changed in 1959 was that it became public. That is the entire difference, and it was enough to move money, which tells you what the previous 117 years had really been about. Not ignorance, attention. Then two other forces arrived, and between them they emptied the place. The first was chemical. New psychotropic drugs shortened stays and made going home possible for acute patients. A ward that had been permanent became temporary. The second was legal and political. In 1964, the hospital began to desegregate after the Civil Rights Act. By June of 1965, it reported that it was fully desegregated. 123 years after opening, the color line inside came down. It is worth marking what that sentence actually contains. This institution segregated its patients from 1866 to 1965. It segregated their wards, it segregated their staff, and it segregated their graves into 4 separate fields. 99 years of it ended in the space of one summer because a federal law required it, not because the hospital reached a conclusion, because somebody outside made it a condition, and 2 governors decided to act, a decade before the national movement. Carl Sanders and then Jimmy Carter began emptying Central State in earnest. Patients with mental illness went to regional hospitals and community clinics. People with developmental disabilities went to small group homes. The institution fought the arithmetic that was killing it in the way institutions do. It renamed itself. In 1967, it became Central State Hospital. Georgia built a regional system of 6 mental hospitals around it. In 1968, the population dropped below 10,000. It was the first time in 2 decades. That same year, the hospital farm closed. The town that fed itself stopped feeding itself. And the fields where patients had worked went quiet. What did not close was the ground under those fields. Because in these same years, out at the edge of the property, the mowing was getting done. The stakes were coming out. The hospital was shrinking. Its records were being boxed. Its farm was shutting down. And in the woods behind it, 10,000 iron markers were being stacked in piles. The men stacking them were wearing prison uniforms. The institution was letting the living go and losing the dead at the same time. Nobody planned that as a symbol. It happened because a lawn needed cutting. And notice who was doing the cutting. By the 1960s, the state of Georgia had prisons on this land. It sent prisoners out to maintain the grounds of the hospital. So the men erasing the graves of one institution were the inmates of another. Neither group chose to be there. Neither group was ever asked. So who goes back into the woods for 25,000 people nobody counted? Not the state, not the hospital. In 1997, a restoration began at Cedar Lane. It was started by an advocacy group called the Georgia Consumer Council. Its membership is made up of behavioral health peers from across Georgia. The system had put those stakes in the ground. The people who went back for them had lived inside it. Nothing had been done about the cemeteries for nearly 30 years. They had discovered that the neglected burial grounds nearby held some 25,000 people. They pledged to restore them and to build a memorial. A grassroots campaign raised the money for the gate. 2,000 of the numbered iron markers were recovered from the woods. They were reinstalled where visitors could see them, in rows, as a memorial, not on the graves. Nobody knows which grave any of them belongs to. They stand together now because they can no longer stand apart. The bronze angel went up 175 yards to the south. Into the concrete of its base went the disc with the 25,000 names. In 2005, the National Park Service acted. It placed Cedar Lane and the other hospital cemeteries on the National Register of Historic Places. Georgia became a leader in cemetery restoration. Similar projects followed across the country. That is the good news in this story, and it is real. It is also the smallest possible version of justice. The graves were segregated in 4: white men, white women, colored men, colored women. 4 fields sorted by the categories that had sorted the living. The hospital itself took another decade to finish dying. In 1999, the Supreme Court of the United States decided Olmstead against L.C. It was a Georgia case. It held that people with mental disabilities have a right to community-based care. That right applies where such placement is appropriate. The decision accelerated the emptying of every institution like this one. Then in 2007, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a series. It was called A Hidden Shame. The reporters were Alan Judd and Andy Miller. They documented at least 115 suspicious deaths across 7 state psychiatric hospitals. The deaths had happened over 5 years. They found a pattern of neglect, abuse, and poor medical care, and they found no public accounting for any of it. 48 years after Jack Nelson, another newspaper walked into Georgia's mental hospitals. It came out with the same story. That is the most damning fact in this entire episode. The United States Department of Justice opened an investigation the same year. In 2010, the department and the state signed a settlement agreement. Georgia committed to moving people out of the state hospitals and into community settings. That applied to people with severe mental illness and developmental disabilities. It agreed to specific targets for housing and treatment. That is not a verdict, and it is not an admission of guilt. It is a signed agreement, and it is a matter of public record. At the start of 2010, 30 patients remained. By the end of that year, the only unit still operating held criminal defendants. Central State stopped accepting new patients in 2010. In 2015, a reporter counted the people still on the campus. There were 179 forensic patients in the Cook Building. Those are people a court has found not guilty by reason of insanity, or people a court has found unfit to stand trial. And 14 other patients remained. All of them were elderly, waiting for a placement somewhere else. 179 and 14, from 12,000 to 193. That is the arc of this building in one comparison. Walk what is left, and the machinery is still legible in the details. The Jones Building was a general hospital. It treated the patients here, and it treated the people of Milledgeville. Its wheeled doors look like they belong on a submarine. They were part of the equipment for steaming and sterilizing garments. In the ward doors, there are rounded portals. They were put there so staff could see a patient hiding in a corner. Every one of those details is a small answer to a practical problem. Together, they are the anatomy of an institution. Nothing here was designed to be cruel. Everything here was designed to be efficient at holding people. Now, the part that closes the circle, and it is not a metaphor. As the buildings emptied, 4 of them were converted into prisons. The marker at Cedar Lane gives directions to the cemetery. The directions are unforgettable. The road runs through a maintenance area and past 2 state prisons. The cemetery turning is just before a third. To visit the nameless dead of a mental hospital, you drive past 3 prisons. Mab Seagrass spent more than a decade researching this institution. She reports the fact that explains why she did it. Today, 90% of the psychiatric beds in the United States are in jails and prisons. Those institutions confine a disproportionate number of African Americans. The asylum did not disappear, it changed its sign. What is left standing is a ruin with a real estate value. The campus has close to 200 buildings. They date from 1842 to the middle of the 20th century. They sit on nearly 2,000 acres in a remarkable variety of architectural styles. Several of the brick buildings around the quad have been boarded up since the late 1970s. There is a pecan grove in the middle of them. The Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation put the site on its Places in Peril list in 2010. It put the site back on in 2020 because the decay had continued. In July of 2023, Governor Brian Kemp signed an executive order. It authorized the demolition of the Walker, the Green, and the Jones buildings. It did not include the Powell, the original. The Georgia Trust and 11 other preservation organizations asked for a reprieve. They wanted 180 days to find a path that did not end in permanent loss. They got one, of a sort. In 2025, a design firm bought the Jones, the Green, and the Walker. It bought them with 8 acres of land for around $45,000. $45,000 for 3 buildings of the largest asylum that ever existed. The announced plan is worth $40 million. The Green becomes a hotel and a conference center. The Jones and the Walker become upscale housing. The campus has been rebranded for business as Renaissance Park. And in the basement of the Jones building are the drawers of the old morgue. They are sealed with iron doors. Today, that building is collapsing from the top down. Falling debris covers the morgue floor. Somebody intends to sell apartments above it. Walk the campus now and the contradiction is everywhere and quite calm. The old railway depot is a museum of Georgia's first capital. The chapel on the quad still holds services and weddings and funerals. Groundskeepers sometimes find dead foxes and hawks inside the abandoned wards. Birds fly in and out of the open windows of buildings that once held 12,000 people. And out past the maintenance road behind the prisons, 2,000 iron markers stand in rows. Each one is a number that no longer points at anybody. In 2024, a small museum in Milledgeville opened an exhibit about this hospital. It was called Death at the Asylum. It gathered what the institution recorded about how its patients died. It laid the documents out on a table taken from the hospital's own morgue. The curator explained the reason for it very simply. So many people passed away at Central State, she said. They thought it was important to note those deaths respectfully. That is the correction being made now, 70 years late, by volunteers in a railway depot. Consider what that exhibit is actually made of. It is made of the paperwork of an institution that recorded everything and protected nobody. The ledgers are complete. The wards are gone. The graves are guesswork. An archive can be meticulous and still tell you almost nothing about a life. Mab Seagrass gave the reason this history has to be told at all. Central State, she says, impacted kinship networks all across the state. Many Georgians, she says, still carry painful shards of this history. So here is what this place actually proves. It was not built by monsters. It was chartered by reformers in an act the legislature understood as mercy. For 30 years, it was run by a doctor who took the chains off. He ate with his patients every day. And it still ended with cages, with a sterilization statute, and with graves nobody can name. The cruelty did not arrive in a single decision. It accumulated, one budget at a time, one census at a time. Every step was reasonable to the person taking it. Cutting the grass faster was reasonable. That is the warning this building leaves behind. Institutions do not usually fail because someone decides to be cruel. They fail because nobody is required to count. 25,000 people are buried on that hill, and the number is an estimate. That estimate is the verdict. New documentaries every week on grim corridors. Subscribe and walk the next corridor with us.